No one knocked at the door, but something was there. Something long buried. And tonight, it chose to surface. This isn't just a story about murder. It's about the secrets hidden behind polite smiles, the emotions never spoken aloud, and the choices that turn people into either monsters or martyrs. If you think you know those around you, this tale will make you think again. But be warned, once it begins, turning back won't be easy, because some truths are so silent, only the heart can hear their scream. It was one of those deceptively tranquil afternoons in early June when the village of Elderwick Hollow basked under a golden haze, the kind of lazy warmth that makes shadows softer and secrets quieter, and where even the birdsong seemed measured, as though aware not to disrupt the fragile calm. On the grounds of the sprawling yet time-worn Hallowmere Grange, Major Percival Harrow, upright, hawk-eyed, and haunted by wars both external and internal, had revived the old midsummer fete, cloaked as a community gathering but stitched with expectation and unresolved history. The croquet match, the event's supposed centerpiece, unfolded across the lawn not as a game, but as a performance of veiled tensions and rusted grievances, a dance of glances and gestures far sharper than any mallet strike. Miss Enid Blackthorne, newly arrived from Shrewsbury, and known for her quiet intelligence and unreadable expressions, sat under the outstretched arms of a gnarled yew tree, knitting without urgency, yet watching, always watching with an unsettling serenity, her grey eyes flickering over the players like a lighthouse scanning stormy waters. Julian Harrow, the Major's only son, had returned after years abroad under the veil of a diplomatic appointment, though village whispers spoke of scandal, not service. His charm was polished but empty, like silver left too long in shadow. Beside him, loitered Eloise Merton, a botanical illustrator, whose sketches were delicate, but whose observations were sharp as scalpels, and Nurse Lillian Wren, whose pale features and withdrawn silence made her seem almost a remnant from another time. Hovering at the periphery, Edgar Blythe, the London solicitor with ink-stained fingers, and the eyes of a man who had once seen something he could never forget, stood with a stiffness that suggested the weight of buried things. The croquet balls clicked in soft percussion, echoing off stone and shrubbery, and for a moment, all appeared harmonious, until Nurse Wren, with a hesitant swing that seemed more emotional than physical, sent the red ball veering sharply toward the overgrown edge of the old hedge maze, a place few dared linger. Julian, ever theatrical, leapt to retrieve it with exaggerated chivalry, but as he disappeared behind the overgrowth, a strange pause followed. Not long but unnaturally quiet, as though time itself had flinched. His voice when it came was not frightened but confused, brittle around the edges. And then, silence, profound and total. The Major's stride across the lawn was fast and clipped, his tone sharp as flint as he demanded clarity. But it was not him who returned first. It was Julian, paler than before, his hands dirty, trembling slightly as he held a small wooden box, its surface scratched and softened by years, its lock snapped long ago. The crowd, once murmuring with forced cheer, fell still. When the box creaked open, the hush deepened. Inside lay a child's silver bracelet, warped and tarnished, bearing the initials E.H. scrawled in a hand too rushed to be careful, and beside it, a croquet mallet, with its handle viciously splintered and stained a dark faded rust that needed no explanation. Something old had resurfaced. Miss Blackthorne, knitting suspended mid-loop, leaned slightly forward, her breath shallow, eyes narrowing as though memories not her own had begun whispering to her. The bracelet triggered a buried tale, her Aunt Millicent's voice echoing faintly in her memory, speaking once, just once, of Eliza Hale, the governess who vanished over 2 decades ago. After a series of discreet but escalating confrontations with Major Harrow's late wife, no police had ever been summoned, no articles written, only the soft suffocation of collective amnesia. Some had said Eliza ran off with a lover, others claimed she wandered near the river, and was simply gone, but there had been no search, no mourning, just erasure. Now, with the broken mallet and the bracelet reappeared, silence gave way to murmurs. Eloise turned pale, her voice caught in her throat, while Nurse Wren seemed frozen, staring not at the objects, but through them, as if seeing something from long ago. Edgar Blythe stepped back, his normally passive eyes suddenly sharp, calculating, afraid. Miss Blackthorn's fingers tensed on the yarn as the weight of the scene settled in her chest, and she realized she was no longer just a guest. She had become a witness to a story desperately trying to resurface. The past, long sealed beneath layers of propriety and rose-scented denial, was now cracking open like old plaster, and the genteel world of cucumber sandwiches, sun hats and croquet smiles was beginning to rot from within. For Miss Blackthorn knew, in the marrow of her bones, that what had been found was not merely a relic, it was a summons. The dead do not rest where lies have been planted, and now that the truth had stirred, it would not be buried again without consequence. Colonel Alistair Redgrave hadn't flinched when the photograph was passed to him during the Rose Garden interlude, but Miss Eleanora Blythe saw what others did not, the precise clench of his jaw, not with anger, nor tinged with sorrow, but with the frozen gravity of recognition, the kind that sinks into a man's marrow like winter reclaiming old ground. His eyes, dulled by age yet momentarily sharpened, settled not on the faces in the frame, but on a glint near the lower corner, a silver locket, half obscured behind a woman's shoulder, insignificant to most, but to the colonel, a shard of the past as sharp as broken glass. That glance lingered too long, too deliberately, before he turned away, not like someone uninterested, but like a man who's looked into a grave, and seen something he once buried. Looking back, to the others, it might have seemed no more than the quiet composure of an aging officer, or the weariness of a long afternoon, but Miss Blythe, who had spent decades listening between words, catching the flicker behind smiles and the silence behind doors, knew what it was, the look of a man whose past had returned in a whisper loud enough to shake his bones, especially now, when the unearthed pendant and the blood-specked walking cane had been found only days prior under the gnarled dogwood tree, exposed by a gardener's misplaced shovel. The day proceeded with the sort of strained gentility only English society can master, a porcelain-cracking civility that masked dread with teaspoons and sugared biscuits. Tea was served on the sun-drenched terrace, as if ceremony could silence suspicion. Redgrave, exact in movement, poured his tea with rigid precision, his lips a thin, unreadable line, avoiding all eye contact with Tristan, his nephew, who stood poised beneath the ivy-wrapped trellis, charming Genevieve Ashcroft, the painter whose elegance served as armor, and whose glance dissected each gesture like a scalpel. Tristan, having returned from a decade of continental exile under rumors too polished to be truths, wore detachment like a well-cut coat, his smile perfectly timed, his speech light and rehearsed like a man who'd memorized the script of civility but no longer believed in the play. He glanced often, too often, toward the manor's upper windows, particularly the far-right dormer, shuttered and dusted, where the light no longer seemed to fall naturally. Miss Ashcroft observed him not as a suitor, but as a subject, cataloguing the tension in his neck, the way he handled his glass, never fully trusting it to the table. The others played their parts in this delicate pantomime. Marius Quinn, the family solicitor, spoke in calculated brevity, weighing each word like a man aware that truth, once spilled, cannot be unsaid. Lydia Fenmore, the orphaned ward with a too-quiet soul, drifted like a shadow through the garden, her gaze often resting on things no one else noticed, the rusted wind chime swaying, though the air was still, the faint stain on the patio stone near the sundial, the sun-bleached ribbon snagged high in the hedge, too far for a child to have tied. The very air had shifted, taut with the weight of unvoiced questions. Redgrave never addressed Tristan directly, always speaking around him, as though the space he occupied had grown uncertain. And Tristan, for all his polish, never crossed the threshold of the library, or lingered near the attic stairs without the telltale flick of hesitation, small, precise, but undeniable, like a man sensing breath behind a locked door. There had been whispers, of course, of the will, of debts owed and promises broken, of a girl named Isabel, spirited, sharp-tongued, and last seen on a rain-slicked night when the power had gone out, and the dogs would not stop barking. Her room was emptied by morning, no search was made. Redgrave had said she left, others had believed it. But Eleanora had never forgotten the damp footprints that led from the east wing corridor to the cellar door, and now, she'd learned, that attic had been opened again, the lock quietly replaced, no explanation given. Lydia, who had once hummed as she walked, now did not speak unless spoken to, her hands trembling each time they brushed silver. And there was something else. Eleanora had noticed the clock in the hallway, now chimed 13 times at dusk. A mechanical fault perhaps, or perhaps not. There was a presence in the house, not visible, not spoken of, but felt, like a breath at your nape when you're alone. As the tea cooled and the conversations meandered in safe circles, Eleanora saw the Colonel glance, barely perceptible, toward the sunroom door. And in that moment, something beneath his stoic facade cracked, not enough for the others to see, but just enough for her. Guilt, she knew. Ages like wine kept in too warm a cellar. It seeps, it sours, it waits. And on afternoons like this, when civility wavers and the dead almost speak, it rises, dressed in the familiar, and knocks not with fury, but with memory sharpened into something far more dangerous. The afternoon sun, though warm in hue, could not thaw the chill that crept through the drawing-room of Whitethorn Grange, where time seemed to have snagged upon something left unresolved, something brittle yet heavy that hung behind every polished corner, and beneath every whispered remark. When the photograph surfaced, delicately passed beneath a stack of old estate records, it did not draw a stir among the assembled guests save for a singular near imperceptible response from Mr. Edwin Langford, the retired historian, invited under the pretext of cataloguing the manor's private collection. His hand, steady until that moment, paused mid-turn as his eyes narrowed upon a faint figure in the background, a child no one had spoken of in years, clutching a worn doll with button eyes, and dressed in the very tartan pattern long believed to have been burned in the hearth after the night of the lock-in. Lady Honoria, always quick to smooth over discomfort with idle chatter, missed it entirely, but Miss Celeste Harrow, seated just across with her glass of cordial untouched, saw the twitch in Langford's jaw, and the involuntary reach of his fingers toward the chain hidden beneath his vest, a gesture she recognized, not as nostalgia, but as a muscle memory, a compulsion born of secrets bound by time and grief. What followed was not an exclamation or a revelation, but a sharpening of atmosphere, as though every shadow in the room had leaned in just slightly. Outside, the manor's aging groundskeeper, Mr. Thorne, was seen near the west garden, pausing at the sundial, no longer functional but never removed, its inscription eroded save for the final word. Miss Harrow had begun to chart the peculiarities, ever since the gardener's shed was found unlocked last fortnight, revealing beneath its dust-choked shelves a satchel bearing initials that did not match anyone presently living at the Grange. Conversation that evening took on an unusual cadence. Words were chosen with such precision, they seemed rehearsed, yet every pause, every breath between sentences, hinted at an unacknowledged terror that none dared speak of plainly. The locket, yes, the one discovered wrapped in velvet and tucked into the false bottom of the music room's ottoman, had reopened more than curiosity. It was the final pebble cast into a pond already trembling from deeper disturbances. Young Margaret Fairchild, the vicar's niece staying for the summer, had begun sketching the manor's portraits in idle hours, and it was she who noted that the child in the photograph bore an uncanny resemblance to the girl in the unfinished painting hidden behind a linen shroud in the east corridor, the one rumored to have been covered the morning after the nursemaid vanished. Margaret's sketches, when laid side by side, made clear what others refused to see, and as dusk descended, casting its bruised hues across the marble floors, Celeste watched Mr. Langford retire early, his candle flickering uneasily in the corridor, and she knew with bone-deep certainty that this place, Whitethorn Grange, was not haunted by ghosts in the traditional sense, but by memories that had learned to walk quietly, wearing the faces of the living, waiting for the hour when silence would finally collapse under its own weight. Beneath the drifting shadows of moonlight, when silence wrapped Rawdon Manor like an old velvet cloak, something long buried stirred again, as though forgotten truths, weary of slumber, had decided to breathe once more. The estate, with its ivy-clad walls and labyrinthine gardens, had always carried whispers of the past, but tonight, the air felt heavier, the quiet more deliberate. Among the newly arrived guests was Ada Whitmore, a reserved pale woman, whose voice was seldom heard, yet whose eyes spoke of entire lifetimes locked behind sealed doors, while others gathered near the crackling fireplace, sipping tea, and murmuring uneasy speculations about the Colonel's sudden illness earlier that week. Miss Ethelyn Price, a retired librarian, with a sharp gaze and a nose for secrets, quietly slipped away toward the eastern veranda. She claimed she needed air, but her instincts had been tugging at her since dusk, and instincts, she knew, rarely lied. From her shadowed perch near the stone balustrade, Miss Price watched Ada seated alone near the edge of the garden maze, fingers delicately caressing a small piece of fabric, old and frayed, like a relic from a forgotten tragedy. After several tense minutes, Ada folded the scrap, placed it carefully into her coat pocket, and disappeared silently into the winding paths of the maze, swallowed whole by the night. That was the moment, Miss Price would later recall, when the night truly shifted. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, with dew still clinging to the hedgerows. But that illusion of peace shattered when Jonathan Evers, distant nephew to the aging Colonel Rawdon, was found lying motionless on the moss-covered path deep within the garden maze. His body, oddly serene, bore no visible injuries, no signs of a struggle, only a small water-stained paper roll clutched near his throat. Written on it in delicate trembling ink, "She warned me, but too late." Panic gripped the manor. The staff whispered, the guests speculated, and Inspector Lennox was summoned. A rigid, rules-bound man with the demeanor of a soldier long past retirement, Lennox preferred facts and motives cleanly tied to greed or betrayal. He questioned the housemaid, the cook, the gardener, even Miss Price, treating each as a puzzle piece to be neatly arranged. Yet while he hunted for motive in the ledgers and lockboxes, Miss Price followed the tremors of emotion, the subtle cracks in human behavior. She traced Ada's steps to the ancient jamun tree, beneath which the earth looked oddly disturbed. With the gardener's help, a small metal box was unearthed, a locket nestled inside. Opening it revealed a faded photograph, a much younger Ada and Jonathan, arms entangled, smiling with a warmth that now felt ghostly. Between them was written in tiny script, "Before they knew." The implications were chilling. A secret romance perhaps, or something more forbidden. Miss Price, drawing on a lifetime of unspoken truths found between pages and in people, realized this was no crime of passion, it was a carefully measured silence finally ruptured. In the days that followed, Ada walked the halls of Rawdon Manor like a spectre, neither grieving nor hiding, merely waiting. For what, none could say. But Miss Price suspected it wasn't justice. Ada awaited, but reckoning. Then came the final conversation. As Inspector Lennox pressed Ada with one last question, his voice tired, his notes disordered. "Did you love Jonathan?" he asked, almost gently. Ada looked up, and for the first time truly met his gaze. Her lips curled into the faintest of smiles, not of remembrance, nor sorrow, but something colder, something final. That smile, Miss Price would later confess, chilled her more than the body in the garden. Because it wasn't the smile of a woman broken by loss, it was the smile of someone who had waited a very long time for a truth to rise, for a ghost to fall silent, and for the last move in a game no one else realized had already ended. As storm clouds churned over the crooked silhouette of Wexley Grange and the cold wind carried whispers through the hedgerows, Miss Eloan Hartley sat quietly in the library, her knitting needles moving with rhythmic precision, though her eyes were far from the wool, sharp, attentive, waiting. The recent and disturbing death of Edmund Vale, the long-absent heir to the Ainsley estate who had returned from a shadowy life abroad only weeks ago, had cast a pall over the village of Greythorne. Though officially deemed a misfortune, an accidental fall near the croquet pavilion during the final hour of the autumn fete, those who knew the estate and its history sensed something darker beneath the surface. Miss Hartley, who had seen more in her quiet years than most did in a lifetime, found herself thinking often of a flippant comment made by Mrs. Renwick, the florist and unrepentant gossip, who had said with a chuckle that the solicitor's carriage was now parked at the Grange more often than the milkman's. At the time, it had been nothing more than village banter, but now, with the house cloaked in secrets and the master confined to his bed under vague circumstances, that remark grew teeth. Edmund's return had been abrupt and oddly timed, aligning too conveniently with Lord Ainsley's sudden illness, a term whispered more than diagnosed, as no physician had been seen until it was too late to be of any real help. Edmund had strutted through the halls with a confident charm, his smiles generous, and his words warm, yet many noted something curiously performative about his demeanor, as though he were playing a role he hadn't quite perfected. When his body was discovered with a neat wound to the throat, too precise for an accident, too clean for a struggle, the tragedy took on a chilling new shape. During the subdued gathering, the following evening, Miss Hartley observed the mourners with a clinician's eye, noting not only who wept, but who watched others for cues, who overplayed their sorrow, and who seemed to exhale as though relieved. Her thoughts drifted to a peculiar exchange she'd overheard days prior, while tending to her garden near the study window. Edmund's voice, low but insistent, demanding answers about something hidden, and Mr. Thorne, Lord Ainsley's solicitor, responding curtly, almost defensively, about old documents that were better left undisturbed. There had been something in Thorne's tone, a kind of panic disguised as professionalism, that suggested he was not only protecting his client's legacy, but his own reputation as well. Later, during a solitary walk near the abandoned chapel grounds, Miss Hartley noticed the gardener unloading a box of Edmund's personal items, retrieved for the inspector's review. Most were mundane: a watch, gloves, a book on maritime law, but his boots held her attention. They were streaked, not with the light dust of the Fettes gravel paths, but with dark, clinging marsh soil, the kind found only along the disused trail that wound behind the family crypt, a place untouched for decades. Why had Edmund gone there, and what had he hoped to find among the dead? That evening, Beatrice Lane, a sweet but meddlesome young artist always eager to contribute, offered a sketch she had drawn early on the morning of the fete, capturing the croquet pavilion in idyllic detail. The inspector smiled politely, but Miss Hartley leaned in, her gaze arresting at one detail. The pavilion curtain, slightly parted. The constable's official report had stated the curtains were drawn and pinned shut when the body was found. So how had Beatrice seen them open, unless she had witnessed something before the discovery, something she had not meant to reveal? Without a word, Miss Hartley folded the sketch, slipping it into her notebook with the care of someone preserving a vital clue. She had learned over the years that drawings often told truths their artist did not recognize, and Beatrice's innocent lines might prove more damning than any confession. In the days that followed, as the inspector chased alibis, and the village buzzed with half-truths, another story emerged, one buried not just in paper, but in shame: a concealed adoption, a rewritten lineage, and an inheritance meant for someone other than Edmund. It became clear to Miss Hartley that this was not a murder of greed or passion, but of fear, a desperate attempt to silence a truth that, if revealed, would dismantle the facade the Ainsley family had so meticulously built. In the end, it wasn't the blood or the body that unraveled the lie, it was the mud, clinging stubbornly to a dead man's boots, and the sketch of a curtain that had opened far too soon. When the faded velvet diary of Eleanor Braithwaite was discovered walled inside the north chimney of Dunmere House, its pages warped by time but still inked with trembling truths, a silence swept through the household like a chill too old to name. It began, as these things do, with the workman's hammer unearthing not just plaster and brick, but memory long entombed in shame and dust. Eleanor had been a governess at Dunmere in the winter of 1902, spoken of in fragments, too educated for her station, too composed to be trusted. The family had never officially acknowledged her departure, only muttered that she'd gone to relatives in Edinburgh, a phrase so shapeless it could hold a body or a scandal or both. But the diary told another tale of late-night encounters with the master of the house, of a child born in the hush of a hidden chamber, and of promises made under the weight of guilt. These were not the rantings of a fragile mind but the deliberate, measured account of a woman unraveling and yet determined to leave behind a version of the truth someone might one day rid. Miss Lydia Mornell, the current housekeeper and a figure as fixed to the manor as its stone lions, felt an unease creep through her bones when she first touched the diary, recognition masked as revulsion. For years she had lived under the shadow of whispers, her employment secured through a curious clause in the will of the late Lady Dunmere, a woman whose bitter smile had often lingered after Eleanor's name was mentioned. And now, with the diary exposed and tongues wagging anew, Lydia's tightly wound silence began to fray. Guests recalled her strange reaction to the portrait in the south corridor, how she would not dust it herself, how she had once muttered, half in dream, "She's still watching." No name had been attached to that oil painting, its frame unsigned, its subject unnamed, but those who looked closely now saw the same high cheekbones, the same eyes shadowed in sorrow that the diary had described. More chilling still was the revelation that young Marianne, the new nursery maid with auburn curls and the housekeeper's pale green eyes, had arrived with no references, no family, no past, except a baptism record from a village 2 counties over, where Eleanor Braithwaite had supposedly been buried. But there was no grave, no stone, only the diary, only the silence. And when the sealed nursery locked since the war was broken open to make room for new lodgers, the workers found behind its shuttered window a cradle, untouched by dust, with a single embroidered cloth bearing the initials EB. Lydia's scream echoed down the corridor before anyone could stop it, and those who heard it never forgot the sound, not because it was loud, but because it carried the weight of a secret finally returned home. Something in Dunmere had been buried alive, and now, after half a century, it had stirred again, not with vengeance, but with memory. And memory, Miss Mornell knew, was a thing far harder to kill than guilt. Ever since an old bracelet was unearthed near the weeping willows behind Blackthorn Manor, the past long buried and intentionally forgotten, had begun to claw its way back into the present. Not merely memories, but whispers of something darker, heavier, like smoke from a fire someone had tried to smother with dirt. Eleanor Blythe, a quiet and thoughtful volunteer librarian at the manor, had always harbored a fascination for local history, but this time, her interest felt different, urgent, almost personal, as though something ancient had reached out from beneath the floorboards and touched her soul. Rumors had begun to swirl once more about Eleanor Corbin, the young woman who vanished without trace more than 50 years ago. She had worked as a kitchen maid at the manor, but her presence had lingered far beyond her station, her beauty, her haunting silence, the way her eyes always seemed to be searching for a way out. On the night she was supposedly dismissed by Colonel Braithwaite, it was said she didn't argue, didn't plead. But the head cook never forgot the raw fear in Elena's eyes. That look had haunted her until her death. Digging through brittle church records in the rectory archives, Eleanor found a strange birth entry from the same year Elena vanished. The child had no surname. The mother's name was simply listed as E. Corbin, domestic. No father, no further entries. The ink had faded, but the implications hadn't. Eleanor's search led her to the attic of Blackthorn Manor, where a dusty nameless trunk lay buried beneath moth-eaten drapes and forgotten furniture. Inside was the scent of age, damp wood, dried flowers, and time itself. She found a tiny wooden toy horse, a half-burnt letter, a faded photograph of Elena, not alone, but beside a man whose face was half cast in shadow. Yet those eyes, those piercing unreadable eyes, matched a face Eleanor had seen many times. In the manor's ancestral portrait gallery, Adrian Braithwaite, the colonel's estranged brother, who had supposedly gone abroad decades ago, and never returned. The photograph alone was unsettling, but it was the diary that chilled her to the bone. Only one page remained legible. He says everything will be fine, but the door stays locked at night. I hear footsteps when there shouldn't be any. I fear tomorrow something will change forever. Eleanor closed the diary with trembling fingers. Something in her gut told her that Elena had never left. She hadn't run away, she had been hidden, buried, not in the ground, but in silence. Then came another revelation. The gardener, Joseph, elderly now but sharp as ever, admitted there was once a hidden cellar beneath the old stables, sealed off years ago, by orders of the colonel himself. No one questioned it, no one dared, but now the soil was stirring, and secrets were ready to rise. The lock on the cellar door gave way with a groan like the house itself was protesting. Eleanor descended stone steps swallowed in damp shadows and stillness. The air below was thick stale, yet laced with something sorrowful. In the center of the room sat a decayed cradle, its wood warped by time, its paint barely visible. Near it lay a charred letter, its last line only barely legible. "She begged me not to tell him," said he, smiles with his mouth but not his eyes. On the wall, faintly etched with something sharp, were the words, "He said it would only be for a few days." Days turned to seasons. I became the echo in the walls no one hears anymore. Just then, as Eleanor stepped back, her foot nudged something, a ring, dulled with age, engraved with the initials, AB to EC. She felt the breath leave her body. The story was no longer myth. Eleanor Corbin had been entombed not in a grave, but in the guilt-soaked bones of the manor itself. The walls had kept her secret. The family had buried her truth beneath layers of silence, propriety, and shame. But the bracelet, the diary, the ring, they had all spoken in their own broken way. Eleanor hadn't just discovered forgotten objects, she had awakened a truth too long silenced, and now that it had risen, it would never sleep again. Blackthorn Manor would never be the same. The ghosts it had hidden were no longer content to whisper, they were ready to be heard. The shed door hadn't merely creaked, it had resisted, groaning like something ancient disturbed from slumber, the metal latch stiff with rust and long disuse, needing both hands and a firm shoulder to force it open. And yet, what lingered like a thorn in Constance Alder's mind was the painting Lily Radcliffe had completed just days before Gareth's body was discovered. The same shed, curiously ajar, sunlight bleeding through the opening like a silent witness. Was it simply the flourish of an imaginative artist, or had Lily seen something she had not consciously registered? Constance, long a student of human nature and the small betraying details it offered, made no accusations aloud. Instead, she tucked the observation deep into that mental cabinet where she stored things that didn't quite add up. To her, artists were strange creatures, truth-tellers not through words but strokes of brush and dabs of pigment. A lie spoken could be retracted, twisted, forgotten. But a lie painted had permanence. And in her experience the hand, unlike the tongue, rarely knew when to dissemble. Old Mr. Denholm, the gardener, had always seemed like a man built from the same roots as the trees he tended, stoic, stubborn, steeped in habits too old to break. But since Gareth's death, even his silence had acquired weight, like the hush before a storm. When Constable Ferrin questioned him, Denholm's answers were curt, reluctant, as though participation in tragedy offended him more than the tragedy itself. Yet Constance, who had spent a lifetime watching people say more through what they didn't say, found a gentler path to truth. Under the guise of discussing the fading autumn dahlias near the east wall, he had, quite unexpectedly, mentioned hearing something that morning, well before dawn broke, something that had stirred unease in him even then. A rustle, he had muttered, and voices too, maybe three. Arguing or whispering, I couldn't tell. He'd dismissed it as drunken revelers, or perhaps the mischievous lads from Millstone Lane, but now, with Gareth's body found and the locked shed breached, those early morning murmurs pressed down on him with unfamiliar gravity. Not long after, under the veil of a stroll meant to offer fresh air, but clearly intended for a more private revelation, Evelyn Moresby, pale and composed but with grief tugging at her mouth's corners, spoke of a letter, one she had received 3 days before her Aunt Helena's fatal collapse. It had arrived postmarked from a solicitor in Hastings, sealed in an envelope she nearly discarded, and inside was a single photograph, sepia-toned and curled at the edges, alongside a note in a familiar but faltering hand. The message was brief yet staggering. There are truths I could not carry into the grave. I leave them to you now, not to forgive me, but to understand me. The photograph showed a young Helena with a child whose features bore a startling resemblance to Evelyn herself, and pinned to the woman's blouse was a locket, silver, oval, with an engraving partially worn away, the very same locket now fueling whispers around the village. Evelyn, dazed and frightened by implications she could not yet grasp, had burned the letter by candlelight, watching the flames erase words she wasn't ready to believe. It wasn't guilt, she insisted. It was fear that the fragile scaffolding of her identity would collapse beneath the weight of a truth too strange to hold. But when the locket resurfaced, buried beneath the garden path, dug up by accident after a sudden rainstorm, it was as if the past had clawed its way back, demanding to be acknowledged. Constance didn't judge her. She understood that it's not always what we destroy that matters, but what survives the fire. Later, in what appeared to be a mundane errand to return a borrowed volume of poetry, Constance found herself in the inner sanctum of Mr. Langford, the family solicitor, a man whose office was an altar to precision. Everything had its place, ledgers stacked like monoliths, papers squared to corners, ink bottles aligned like soldiers. And yet, behind the facade of control, a loose panel in the lower drawer revealed something carelessly hidden, drafts of a revised will, unsigned, but damning. One draft contained a passage, hastily crossed out, referring to provision for a dependent not publicly acknowledged. And in a scribbled margin beside it, the initials GT, Gareth Thornhill. Was he the secret heir, the mistake, the debt from decades ago finally coming due? Whatever the case, someone had learned the truth before they were meant to. And someone, perhaps out of vengeance, perhaps desperation, had decided that truth should remain buried, along with Gareth. Constance knew then, as surely as she knew the smell of smoke on wool, or the tremble of a guilty breath, that this was no accident, no random misfortune. This was a reckoning, long delayed. And in the silent corridors of Eastmere House, the ghosts of old sins had begun to wake. The room had been immaculately arranged, every object in place as though untouched by the turmoil of recent days. Yet Miss Elira Gray noticed something that others might have overlooked, a faint, delicate fragrance in the air, not artificial or overbearing, but hauntingly familiar. The kind of scent that lingered not on skin, but in memory. A powdery trace of violets, soft yet dignified, belonging not to a young coquette, but to a woman of an earlier era, one who moved through the world with quiet poise and a signature of subtle grace. It was the same scent once associated with Mabeth Holloway, a name now whispered only in shadows at the manor, a girl whose departure had been explained away with such casual finality, that no one dared look beneath the surface. You always knew when Mabeth had been in a room, Lady Thornbridge had once said, her voice heavy with something unspoken. The violets told you. Elira said nothing, only let her gaze settle on the crystal bottle on the side table, its label long since worn away, but its essence unmistakable. What interest would a man like Gerald Fenwick have in such a perfume, unless it wasn't about vanity, but something else, something more dangerous? Remembrance. Elira knew, as few others did, that memory was often more potent than motive, and scent more telling than any spoken word. Inspector Ralston, for all his cold precision and methodical diligence, had no patience for what he considered distractions of the feminine kind. Yet even he could not ignore the envelope that had been slipped beneath his door late the previous night, plain, unmarked and chilling in its silence. Inside was a single typed line, its ink uneven as though punched by weary keys on an old ribbon. The final game ended long ago. This is merely the reckoning. There was no name, no accusation, no command, only a dreadful calmness, a tone that did not threaten, but reminded. And that, Elira understood, was what made it so disturbing. It wasn't the voice of someone caught in panic, it was the whisper of someone who had waited, watched, and chosen this moment with chilling calculation. The croquet match, the hidden locket, the erased portrait beneath the trap door. The scent of violets where violets should not be. These were not coincidences, they were echoes of something buried long ago, of a story never resolved, but only concealed, and now it was pressing its way back to the surface like roots beneath a stone floor. Elira was no stranger to secrets wrapped in civility, nor to guilt dressed in polite conversation, and as the morning sun spilled gently across the croquet lawn, its serenity at odds with the storm brewing beneath it, Colonel Wexley gathered the remaining guests in the manor's library, a room once meant for reading now filled with the weight of withheld truths. He sat solemnly by the fireplace, Gerald Fenwick behind him, arms folded, expression unreadable. Felicity Ambrose, slouched in a velvet armchair, her nonchalance betrayed only by the frantic tugging of her sleeve. Iris Talbot entered last, her eyes avoiding every face. And then silence. Not the hush of anticipation, but the solemn stillness that comes before something is finally laid bare. Elira, seated near the hearth, began to speak, not with flair or accusation, but with the careful calm of someone who no longer speculated, only recounted. She spoke of Mabeth not as the runaway everyone claimed she was, but as someone deliberately removed, erased from memory with the same ease as a name struck from a guest list. She spoke of the locket, the hidden painting whose face had been smeared into oblivion, of the early morning voices that were not ghosts but rehearsals of guilt. She spoke of a perfume that had outlived the woman who once wore it, and of choices made in the quiet corners of the past that were now demanding their due. And as her words hung in the room like dust in sunlight, it became clear this murder was not born of rage, not born of chance, but of something far more complex. A quiet promise kept, a final piece moved in a game long thought forgotten. The killer had not acted in a moment of madness, they had simply fulfilled what had always been waiting to happen. And Elira knew now what many in the room were only beginning to suspect. Some truths do not stay buried, they wait beneath the surface, breathing until someone finally listens to the silence. She paused, but not as a performer craving attention, nor as a tactician measuring her moment. Instead she paused the way the wind stills before a storm breaks, the kind of pause that allows the weight of truth to expand and settle in the room like dust disturbed from old forgotten shelves. No one dared to speak, no breath rose to challenge her, for what followed was not a revelation but an unveiling, of something ancient long suppressed, and too fragile to be shouted aloud. The silence that answered her was not the stunned silence of disbelief, but the hushed reverent stillness of slow painful recognition, as if each soul in that richly adorned drawing room had suddenly remembered a sin they had not realized they had committed. Elira Gray, composed and unflinching, stood before them not as an accuser, but as the final keeper of a truth that had waited in shadows too long. And with the soft deliberate clarity of someone who had sifted every grain of the past, she spoke it aloud, that Elise Morland, raised modestly, identified by others only as the quiet and capable governess, was in truth the hidden daughter of Eleanor Vale, the woman whose disappearance had been conveniently mourned, quietly whispered over, and ultimately erased. A hush fell deeper then, as if even the walls, the ancient portraits, the creaking floorboards, the heavy velvet curtains held their breath, remembering the day Eleanor was sent away, with only a trunk, a secret swelling in her belly, and a promise that had dissolved the moment the door shut behind her. Lydia Fenwick's hand trembled slightly against her teacup. Judge Redcliffe's jaw twitched, his proud composure cracking like aged varnish. But Elise did not stir. She sat still, perfectly still, not out of shock, but as if she had been preparing for this moment all her life. Her eyes remained calm, yet held within them the sorrow of decades carried in silence. Elira, unwavering, continued. She described the locket hidden behind a false panel in the attic, containing not a photograph, but a lock of infant hair tied with Eleanor's ribbon, and a note never sent. The baptismal record recovered from a half-rotted registry book misfiled in the parish archives, and the ring worn unknowingly by Elise since youth, engraved in a cipher that only Eleanor's closest confidants would recognize. Each piece was not a weapon, but a key, and the locket opened was not just lineage, but legacy. Elise had not returned to claim fortune or title, she had returned to reclaim her truth, to unearth her own name from beneath layers of carefully constructed lies. Judge Redcliffe, so long the guardian of silence, finally found words, but they came to him brittle and dry. I did what I was told. It was meant to protect the family. But the word family sounded hollow now, as if it no longer belonged to the bloodline he had served so loyally. Vincent Morland, until now a figure cloaked in aloof politeness, stepped forward with quiet intensity. It had been he who had discovered the diary Eleanor had hidden, he who had recognized Elise's resemblance to a woman he once loved and failed, and he who had returned to Eastwick Hall, not for closure, but to mend what had been shattered before Elise was even born. What had taken place here, Elira made clear, was not the story of a single betrayal, but of many small silences compounding into a wound passed down through time. No law had been broken, no crime formally recorded, yet the weight of what had been stolen, the right to belong, to know, to be acknowledged, was heavier than any gavel could impose. Elise asked for nothing, no one dared offer apology, and yet, in that long echoing quiet, something ancient shifted, ancestry realigned, ghosts stirred, and a history once silenced began to whisper again. What had been forgotten had returned, what had been hidden had risen, and in the heart of that storm stood Elise, not as an intruder, but as the only rightful inheritor of a past that had refused to die quietly. He hadn't returned for reconciliation, nor for some sentimental notion of family ties or legacy. Sebastian's return was not a homecoming, it was a reckoning, a quiet tempest wrapped in silk and dust, and its first murmur began the instant he stumbled upon that brittle bundle of yellowed letters, hidden with such careless desperation behind the false back of an old walnut drawer in the late Colonel Ashworth's private study, a drawer seldom opened and never questioned. The letters, penned in a feminine hand trembling with longing, desperation and decay, belonged to Clara, a name long forgotten by the family, spoken only once in a slurred whisper by the Colonel after his third brandy, and never again. Clara had once dreamed within those inked lines, her youth aching with hope and heartbreak, each word a thorn, letters that bled with yearning, and eventually dissolved into quiet despair. In them were cloaked references to a child, cloaked in metaphor and misery, never named, but clearly unwanted, a consequence of promises made in gaslit hallways, and broken beneath the weight of silence and status. These letters did not just reveal, they exhumed, they accused and they cursed. And Sebastian, ever the opportunist, did not weep for the past but smiled at the leverage it presented. He hadn't come to forgive, he had come to bargain, to use the truth, not as a means of healing, but as a scalpel to cut his way through inheritance and silence alike. Miss Eleanora Dane, the village's quiet shadow with eyes too sharp for comfort, believed Sebastian had approached the Colonel, not with threats, but with that most dangerous weapon, knowledge. And with knowledge, the mere suggestion of scandal could unravel decades of carefully curated dignity. One whispered sentence in the wrong ear, a half-truth murmured to an old friend at the club, or a solicitor's nudge in the archives, could tear the Ashworth name apart. But what Sebastian never calculated, what his arrogance never allowed, was the raw volatility of guilt held too long in brittle hearts. The Colonel, long frail, and hollowed out by years of pretending the past never happened, had not responded, not with anger, nor with panic. Someone else had. And that is where the tragedy took root, Eleanora whispered like wind curling through a graveyard. Sebastian never intended to expose the truth, only to control it, to dangle it like a noose and watch others tremble. But secrets do not like chains, they rot when caged, and in time they poison the hand that feeds on them. When Eleanora's gaze shifted toward Edmund Clark, the family's solicitor of nearly 3 decades, the man who had buried mistakes with the precision of legal ink and kept scandal from surfacing with surgical grace, it was not accusation in her eyes, but empathy of a dangerous sort. For what is loyalty, when fermented too long in silence, if not corruption in its most palatable form? Edmund did not flinch, but something ancient and brittle shifted in him. His composure, long held like breath beneath water, began to tremble. She spoke not of blood or fingerprints, but of motive, of a man who had spent his life not just managing this family's affairs, but preserving its illusions, editing out sins with every draft of a will, sealing away ghosts with every hidden codicil. Sebastian's return had not been a reunion, it had been an invasion, and when Sebastian laughed that day in the greenhouse, his voice cruel and victorious, the truth dangling from his tongue like a blade, Edmund hadn't seen a man, he had seen a ruin in progress. The mallet, lying by the potting bench, had not been chosen, it had simply been there. One motion, one unthinking moment, and silence returned with terrible finality. It was not a murder planned in malice, he insisted, it was a reflex, a snap of loyalty hardened into instinct. He had wiped the mallet down, tried to polish the wood to disguise the tremble in his hands, buried it beneath old garden refuse behind the shed. But time, Eleanora murmured, betrays even the most careful hands. The mallet, once exhumed, bore not the marks of age, but of recent care, its wood too smooth, the handle faintly oiled, a detail small enough to miss, but damning to the eyes that see. And then there was the shed, declared shut since the last storm, yet young Isabel's idle sketch, drawn while she sat scribbling beneath the oak tree that morning, showed its door slightly ajar, its hinge bent just so, a detail no one noticed, except the one who watches the world by its shadows. That, Eleanora said, was the final knot pulled tight. Edmund hadn't meant to kill, but when truth is forced underground for too long, it does not die, it waits, and when it rises, it does so in screams. Now the room, once filled with denial and defense, sat heavy with resignation. Eleanora, calm as ever, looked once more toward the hearth where fire no longer burned, and spoke with a sorrowful clarity that stilled every breath. "The law," she said, "does not measure the love in your heart, it only weighs the blood on your hands." And beyond the window, as if echoing that final judgment, the grandfather clock struck its chime, deep, solemn, and final, like the toll of a soul unburdened far too late. The Windmere estate, cloaked in the slow decay of aristocratic grandeur, and wrapped in a hush that had not been disturbed in years, loomed like a mausoleum for the forgotten sins of those who once laughed too freely within its halls. When Alaric Grayson returned after 2 decades abroad, his name barely whispered among the village folk, it was not grief that followed him, but reckoning. He had inherited nothing but silence and unanswered questions, a childhood spent in shadows cast by portraits of men whose blood he shared, but whose eyes never looked down upon him with familiarity. Yet something had called him back, a pull not of memory, but of unfinished memory, the kind that leaves jagged spaces in a man's mind where truth ought to be. The east wing of the estate had remained bolted since the winter of 1978, when the governess, Miss Lillian Harrow, had vanished without explanation, her name struck from the household ledgers with an efficiency that reeked of erasure rather than absence. It was there, behind warped cabinetry and a floorboard pried loose with quiet desperation, that Alaric discovered a bundle wrapped in a child's faded blanket, inside, brittle pages of a journal, inked with the frantic hand of a woman whose words had the weight of someone writing to survive. She had spoken of threats shrouded in courtesy, of secrets carried in the hush of midnight footsteps, of a boy who bore the family's eyes but not its name, and most chillingly of a lullaby that was only ever sung when danger was near. The entries stopped suddenly, as though someone had silenced the pen as well as the voice. Alaric, burning with the cold clarity of a man betrayed by history, did not pause for grief. Instead, he traced her words like footsteps in snow, moving room to room, peeling back the polished lies of the estate, until he reached the conservatory cellar, long thought collapsed. It was not. Dust lay evenly across crates except in one place, where a trail curved like a question mark leading behind stacked boxes. There, beneath a canvas cover, he found it, a child's slipper, velvet worn, the black ribbon frayed, and beside it, a silver rattle bearing the family crest, items that had no business being anywhere but a nursery, and yet lay here, entombed in a room meant for tools. He summoned no authorities, only Drusilla Moore, the retired schoolmistress and keeper of quiet truths, who had once catalogued the estate's forgotten records. It was she who remembered Lillian's dismissal, the baby born in winter, and the sudden silence that followed one storm-tossed night. Drusilla, unflinching, took the slipper in hand, and followed its story backward, not through evidence, but through absence. The wing that never reopened, the cradle that disappeared overnight, the sudden change in household staff, and the ledger gap, where one name had clearly been scratched out. When she confronted Eloan Blake, the former matron now frail and half-blind, Eloan did not weep. Her voice trembled, not with guilt, but with release. She told them of a scandal buried by wealth, the child born of Lillian, and the late Lord Windmere, a child never acknowledged, a governess, who had begged not for wealth, but for belonging, and a night where refusal turned violent, not in rage, but in the cold panic of a man fearing exposure. Lillian had fallen, struck not by a blow, but by fate's unkind hand, and the child, too young to understand, had followed her into the dark when no one came. Eloan had buried them both, in silence, in soil, in story, and sealed the east wing, not with locks but with shame. Alaric, it turned out, was not the heir in truth, but the twin smuggled away under the guise of charity, his brother left behind to die unnamed. He did not cry out or accuse, instead he stood before the croquet lawn, where laughter once echoed, and understood what the house had tried so hard to forget. that silence was not innocence, and denial was not absolution. He left the estate the next morning, not as its owner, but as its witness. Drusilla remained behind, watching as ivy reclaimed the walls and the wind returned to its whisper. The law would never touch Windermere, but justice, she knew, was not always served in courtrooms. Sometimes it lived only in the knowing, in the stillness that follows when the dead are finally heard, and the living are forced to remember. She stood at the edge of the drawing room, the dying light catching her profile like a sculpture carved from grief itself, silent, unmoving, yet unbearably alive. When the Major finally confessed, his words cracked like brittle twigs under the weight of years, every syllable, a shard pulled from some wound too long left to fester. She listened without flinching, her hands folded not in surrender, but in the deliberate stillness of someone who had endured more storms than she had ever spoken of. Her name was Evelyn Ashcroft, daughter of the woman buried beneath layers of family disgrace and half-truths, niece to the man whose hands trembled as he admitted what no court had ever asked him to. When he finished, the silence between them stretched, taut, tense but unbroken, not with forgiveness, but with recognition, of suffering, of choices made in cowardice, and of legacies shaped by what people refused to face. Inspector Raines asked quietly if she wished to press charges. The law, he reminded her, was on her side, and justice had been long denied. But Evelyn, voice soft but unshaking, simply said, "He's been imprisoned far longer than the law could manage, trapped in a moment he never escaped from. Let him rot where his conscience put him." It was not mercy nor absolution. It was the end of a cycle she refused to inherit. No courtroom could restore what was lost. No prison could match the slow erosion of a man who had watched himself decay from the inside. Raines nodded, and left her standing there, her eyes fixed not on the Major but on the old portrait above the hearth, the face of a woman who had once dared to speak and been punished with silence. Days passed, and the house, Greystone Hollow, settled back into its unnatural quiet, its rooms no longer echoing with secrets, only with absence. The garden remained untouched, its hedges overgrown, its roses blooming redder than ever, as if fed by the blood of truths unearthed too late. Evelyn took tea alone now, beneath the veranda where her mother once read poetry aloud to the wind. She stirred her cup slowly, eyes distant, and thought not of justice but of inheritance, not of wealth or titles, but of silence, shame, and the choices one made when faced with the ruins of another's cowardice. She thought of how cruelty often wore the face of decorum, how it walked quietly through corridors lined with family portraits, and how the most dangerous weapon was not the blade or the bullet, but memory, unchecked, unspoken, unhealed. The Major had played his game, not with malice, but with fear, the same fear that had silenced her mother, broken her family, and nearly claimed her too. But Evelyn had chosen differently. She had listened, she had remembered, and she had refused to pass the poison forward. In that small act, a legacy shifted, not healed, not forgotten, but no longer in control. And as the breeze stirred the curtains and the last light fell through the stained glass in fractured reds and blues, Evelyn whispered to no one in particular, "We end it here." And for the first time in generations, the house did not argue. The days that followed the incident at Greystone Hollow unfolded not with the fanfare of resolution, but with a stillness that seemed to hush the very breath of the village, not out of fear, but out of respect for the truth that had surfaced like a long-buried relic. There was no formal announcement, no headline in the parish bulletin, and yet a quiet understanding passed from door to door like wind through wheat. Mrs. Larkins at the grocer began arranging her display with a curious symmetry, as if the apples and pears might balance something deeper, while young Thomas, who once darted across the village green without care, now glanced at the old sundial near the war memorial, with something like suspicion. The sundial, once decorative, had been the site of whispered conversations, and one overlooked fragment of a torn glove, small things. But in Miss Renly's mind, small things were always where the rot began. Inspector Holcroft had closed the case officially, though his eyes lingered longer on the Hollow's gates than was strictly necessary when he left, the way one watches a sleeping dog that might yet wake. The croquet lawn, whose gentle slopes once echoed with lazy summer chatter, stood now like a page unfinished. The mallet used in the affair, never named directly in conversation, had been removed of course, but no one asked when it might return, nor if it should. In its place, a faint imprint remained on the grass, a hollow dent that no gardener dared smooth out. Mrs. Everleigh, the head of housekeeping, polished the silver with extra care, not from duty, but from a need to make something clean again. Meanwhile, Eleanor Bell, once considered merely a spinster librarian, had taken to walking the village lanes again, her chin higher than before. She had been the one after all, who'd seen through the alibi, not by logic, but by the unnatural placement of a book, the history of naval clocks, which no man in the hollow had cause to read, let alone shelve backwards. In this place of manners and quiet rituals, it was not the act of violence itself that haunted, but the realization of what had been built around it, the subtle betrayals, the glances passed like poison, the alliances forged over lemon sponge and weak tea. Miss Renly, seated once more beside the window where the roses bloomed anew, allowed her gaze to drift, not over the lawn or toward the house, but inward, where the true mystery always lay. She thought of the hesitant smile the vicar gave the colonel's widow, the way a clock in the hall had stopped at the hour of death, and had not yet been wound again, and she wondered, not for the first time, if some silences are not meant to be broken, but understood, like the final move in a match where no one cheers, but everyone remembers. The village had not healed, not fully, but it had absorbed the truth, let it settle like mist, and in doing so, preserved something older than justice, the recognition that what is buried is never truly gone, and that peace, when it returns, walks slowly, and never without a shadow. She traced the rim of her teacup slowly, the spoon turning in a quiet rhythmic circle, an unconscious ritual that seemed to stir not sugar, but memory, guilt, and the faint scent of something long forgotten. Outside, the garden lay in gentle stillness, roses nodding like mourners who knew when to bow their heads, and inside, Eleanor Graves sat alone, her thoughts echoing louder than the clock's steady ticking. People were rarely born cruel, she mused, but rather shaped by time, silence and shame, twisted gently by the weight of secrets too heavy to carry and too dangerous to set down. Most wrongdoings in her experience weren't born of hatred but of fear, fear of disgrace, fear of love unreturned, of a truth so devastating that it had to be buried alive, wrapped in layers of civility, and locked away behind smiles that said, "Everything is fine." But secrets, she knew, do not rot quietly, they fester, ferment, and eventually claw their way to the surface. And that is exactly what had happened at Hollowmere House, where the hedges had always been trimmed just so, where teacups never clattered, and where generations had trained themselves not to see what lay just beyond politeness. The croquet lawn was green again, immaculate, its symmetry restored, but it was a hollow restoration, like setting a fractured bone without treating the damage beneath. The mallet had not been returned, it remained sealed away, an artifact of something unspeakable, not legally damning anymore, but emotionally radioactive, untouchable. No one said it aloud, but no one picked up its replacement either, and the game, the harmless genteel game, that had once marked the rhythm of Hollowmere summers, simply stopped. Life resumed, yes, but not as before. It was as if the village had inhaled, and never quite exhaled. And Miss Graves, who had once been dismissed as merely observant, found herself regarded now with a quiet reverence, because it was she who had noticed the things no one else did. The photo frame deliberately turned inward, the scent of lilac in a locked room where lilac had not bloomed for years, the half-smile that never reached the eyes when someone mentioned the victim's name. It had never been about the murder, not really, it had always been about the aching silences that led up to it, the desperate decisions, the loneliness so profound, it turned into violence. And in the end, when Iris had faced the man responsible for her mother's quiet unraveling, she had chosen something deeper than punishment. She had chosen understanding, perhaps not forgiveness, but not vengeance either. Eleanor wondered, not for the first time, if she herself could have done the same. Could you? If the one who shattered your peace stood before you, stripped of arrogance but still cloaked in past sins, would you demand justice with cold finality, or would you offer the mercy of letting the past bury itself once and for all? These are not simple questions, and they never have simple answers. We invite you to reflect, to comment, to share what path your own heart might take. Your voice, like every subtle clue in a mystery, adds something vital to the whole. And if this tale has resonated with you, if the soft unraveling of secrets, and the quiet echo of conscience spoke to something within, consider subscribing for more stories spun in shadow and silence, where truth is a whisper, and justice wears many faces. Share this with someone who understands that the most dangerous lies are not shouted, but whispered behind porcelain cups. Until we meet again, keep your tea warm, your instincts sharper than ever, and remember, some of the darkest truths hide not in the pages of confession, but in the pauses between carefully chosen words, and it is there, in the spaces no one wants to look, that the real mystery waits.